Hello, and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer. Six months ago, the world turned upside down for Australian Jewry when the unimaginable happened. At a large and festive Hanukkah celebration on the beach in Bondi, right outside Sydney, more than 1,000 people were celebrating the holiday of Hanukkah when two gunmen opened fire on the celebration in a terror attack that left 15 people dead and more than 40 people wounded. It was the second deadliest attack in Australian history. The event didn't just affect the Jewish community, it was a national trauma. And the country is still absorbed in process of investigating how it happened and how it can be prevented from happening again. At the same time, the Jews of Australia, as in the diaspora worldwide, continue to cope with the revived tide of anti-Semitism and anger and hostility to the State of Israel. Where does Australia and its Jewish community stand after more than 6 months of grieving and grappling with what's happened? We'll find out in this conversation. Here in the studio to update us on what's happening after just over 6 months since the Bondi attack is a visitor to Tel Aviv from Sydney, Daniel Hochberg. He is a member of the Jewish community, too many affiliations really to list. Among them are the Union for Progressive Judaism, the Association of Jewish Holocaust Survivors, he's from a survivor family, and their descendants, and the Sydney Jewish Museum Board, just to name a few. Also joining me to speak with Daniel is Noa Levin, Australian-Israeli editor here at Haaretz. Hello, Daniel. Hello, Noa.
Hello,
Hey. Thanks for joining me. Daniel, the attack at Bondi happened at a time when so many Jewish communities around the world are fraught with division over Israel, over events in the Gaza war. Bondi sort of stopped all of the debates as they were happening. Were they a source of more division? Was the attack a source of unity, bringing the community together? Can you sort of take the pulse of what's going on among Australian Jews 6 months after the attack?
Interesting. Firstly, when it happened, it was a shock. And then again, I can contradict myself and say it wasn't a shock. The Jewish community felt that the previous couple of years since October 7th had been leading towards something like this, although I don't think any of us quite envisaged the magnitude of the incident. I mean, we'd had a number of incidents within the Australian community, including the firebombing of synagogues and so on and so forth. So there were actually physical manifestations of anti-Semitism happening. And to be fair, anti-Semitism was rising prior to October 7. So there is a curve and it's upward.
There was a lot of anger in the Jewish community over sort of the unwillingness of the authorities to take seriously their warnings that they said that it could have been prevented if they were listened to. There was a feeling of anger. Is that anger still there 6 months later?
I think so. Although from my perspective, I think that the government has gone some way to trying to deal with the issues, whereas prior to December the 14th, you would say that the government had failed the Jewish community as the anti-Semitism.
Australian Jews refer to December the 14th the way we talk about October 7th, or in America, people talked about 9/11.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. So December 14, if I said December 14, everyone in Australian Jewry understands exactly what I'm speaking about. I guess the wider community would refer to it as the Bondi massacre. It's had a profound impact, not just on the Jewish community, but also on the wider community. There was a lot of goodwill post-December 14. And to be fair, December 14 was the moment in which it galvanised the government to act on some of the issues that the Jewish community had been raising over the last few years.
Noah, what's your perception of what's happened in the Jewish community?
Inside the Jewish community itself, internally? Well, I think it's important to recognize, especially for an American listener, that something like this was totally unimaginable in Australia. We don't have guns. It's not a thing that exists for us. And so I think the entire experience was quite shocking for everyone and took months for everyone to understand actually what has happened, and a lot of the reaction has been about that as well, and a reality of gun violence that we could never really quite imagine in the most popular place in Australia, really. But I think internally in the community, it's been this wider conversation of who speaks for the Jewish community, especially as we've had these eyes on us from outside. I mean, I say us, I haven't lived there for many years, but it does feel like suddenly the Jewish peak organizations have been elevated to quite a national status, really. And I think internally for Jewish people, especially young Jewish people who maybe feel a bit further from the Jewish establishment of the community, it's opened this really interesting conversation of who gets to speak for us at a national and international level, and what recommendations would all kinds of Jews like to see to ensure their safety in Australia. And I think that touches, of course, on the intersection between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism and what's the line. And I think the Bondi attack made, rightly so, the community incredibly sensitive to anything that looked, felt, smelt like something that could harm us. And they have every right to do that, but I think it created something quite challenging there in terms of discourse about Israel especially.
Let's quickly review the political reaction on the national front in Australia. The government is a centre-left Labor government, and pretty quickly after the attack, the Conservative opposition was using the attack as a cudgel, talking about the pacing of gun reforms, the formation of the Royal Commission, which is, really underway right now and we'll discuss. So it has been really a political flashpoint, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. I'd probably correct that in terms of the opposition. They were against gun reform. So they come from a more conservative side of politics. And in fact, they called for the Royal Commission. We had a lot of trouble getting the Royal Commission up and running because one aspect of it was the security aspect. In particular, the issue around gun laws was something that was very controversial from the point of view that the Conservatives were less willing to impose gun restrictions.
So they were trying to attack the government for not protecting the Jewish community, but they didn't want to take steps towards protecting everyone by even tightening the already tight gun laws in Australia.
I guess that's the case. I mean, the reality is that as a community, we would probably rather fly under the radar than become a political issue in Australia. And I think that's not unusual across the world. We see that in America today, where Israel and Jews are a major election issue. We would prefer not to be that.
Prime Minister Albanese initially opposed the formation of a royal commission, right?
Yeah, he did. And I think there was also a lot of pushback in terms of free speech as well. And people were worried about what ramifications it would have on the kind of speech that was allowed in Australia, which there is a small but loud part of the country that really deeply cares about that. But I think it was this interesting, complicated reality of how much was this intelligence and security failure that happened to target the Jews, and how much actually was it a building of really anti-Semitic rhetoric that the Jews had been warning about. And I think the government preferred it to be the first one rather than the second, and eventually understood that it was probably both of the things, but very much had been building towards some kind of violent manifestation of really quite anti-Semitic discourse that had been normalized in a lot of the country, where in the past we've dealt with neo-Nazi sort of small fringe groups in Australia for many years. That's been sort of quite a thing that everybody knows is not acceptable. But I think since October 7th, it's become much more normalized amongst ordinary people, which you can hear from people's sort of testimonies now since this has happened.
So yeah, they're testimonying in front of this Royal Commission, which is up and running. It's called the Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion. They added on the social cohesion. They're having public hearings. The goal is to investigate the prevalence and key drivers of anti-Semitism and make recommendations to the government. The commissioner is supposed to hand down, or has handed down, the interim report in April, but the full report has a deadline, no later than the anniversary of December 14th. So, Daniel, can you catch us up on what has happened in and around the Royal Commission so far? Who's testified? What's been made public? What has sort of caught the attention of the Australian public? And it's a thing. It makes big headlines.
It makes headlines. It made greater headlines as always at the start of it than it is today. I don't think it has a great presence at the moment.
The first day of testimony.
Yeah. You know, like it starts off with a bang, and then it's sort of receded a little bit because there's been plenty of other things happening as always in Australia, and particularly issues around tax law and things like that. So that's sort of dominated the news. So there have been two aspects to it. The first is they did issue an interim report, and the key thing around the interim report was security issues. And so that was the reason that there was extra emphasis placed on the interim report, because it was immediate needs of the security and safety of, in particular, the Jewish community in Australia. And so it was important to try and understand there's a lot more work to be done in that security, but there were a couple of key recommendations out of that report that they want to implement almost immediately. And as I understand it, the government said that they would implement all of the recommendations of that particular report.
And are they impactful recommendations? Are there things that you think will,
sure.
calm people down, or does it feel performative?
No, I think they're practical implications that speak to the safety of the Jewish community and perhaps other communities in Australia. So, for example, gun law changes to ensure that the proliferation of guns is a little bit less than it was previously. And by the way, we have some of the tightest gun laws in the world today.
Which is why people were amazed that this happened, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very rare that these sort of events happen in Australia, if at all. The last event, it was in the 90s. It was a massacre in Tasmania and wasn't related to anything other than a lone wolf individual who obviously had mental issues, etc. As far as political events like this, it's almost unheard of in Australia that politics would be a motivation for an incident like that. And there were some recommendations that they didn't release as well because they related to security issues, and the government felt that it was too sensitive to talk to those issues at this point in time in the public arena. I've got to be honest with you, the security issues ultimately are a lot easier to deal with. And I know that may seem strange in a country like Israel, but they're easier to deal with because they say if you need stronger gun laws, okay, you need stronger gun laws. In the case, there was the Commonwealth counter-terrorism coordinator was a part-time role, and that speaks more to Australian society and the fact that this sort of thing is unprecedented than anything else. So they made it a full-time role, So these things are easy to implement. But you yourself talked about the title of the Royal Commission, which is into anti-Semitism, and this is the big social cohesion. I mean, wow.
Is that code for other kinds of racism too?
As far as I've seen in the way that the Royal Commission has conducted itself, and given the amount of time that has been allowed for the Royal Commission to take place, and by the way, this is going to be one of the shortest Royal Commissions in history. Usually they range over a number of years. I would suggest you that the focus will be on the Jewish community and anti-Semitism.
Hey, you're a step ahead of us. We haven't had one on October 7th yet.
That's right. What I can say about the Royal Commission today, as we stand now, a couple of weeks ago there were 14,500 submissions to the Royal Commission. I spoke to someone today who thinks that by the time the submissions close, that there will be up to 20,000 submissions. Just to put that in perspective, that is the most submissions ever. Has there been an
impact of the people now that, they passed the security issues, and now they addressed another stage, which was people coming and talking about anti-Semitic incidents, and, teachers talking about in schools, and kids, and people talking about feeling threatened? Has that had any kind of reverberations in the Australian public or not? Or has it been brushed off?
I wouldn't say it's been brushed off. I mean, people are listening, and I think that it must be having some sort of impact. The thing about Royal Commissions is that most Royal Commissions that happen, the recommendations are rarely implemented by government. And if they are implemented, it's at a very watered-down level. So the real question, I think, that the Jewish community in particular is asking itself is, what will be the impact of this commission? Will we, in fact, get the change that we're looking for across so many areas?
Noa, has there been pushback against all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tricky thing about the commission, and it is important to say that it's the highest form of independent judicial inquiry that the country has. So it very much has been given an important and respected place in the Australian public and has been incredibly public. But I think the key, as you touched on, has been these very personal stories of people in their ordinary lives experiencing day-to-day anti-Semitism. A lot of stories about kids at school and kids at sport, and the experience of the Jewish schools, which really are quite harrowing and very shocking to listen to, even when I listen to them. And so I think it feels like there is a much bigger hill to climb, because you can't immediately change the attitude of a country where most people haven't met a Jewish person before, because we're such a small percentage of the population there. That feels almost insurmountable, or like it will take a very long time, and something handed down by a commission won't change immediately. The commissioner, Virginia Bell, who is a former judge, she made it quite clear at the beginning that her job wasn't to litigate the conflict in the Middle East as part of her role, I suppose, and part of the commission wasn't to try and do that. Though I do know that a lot of the Jewish community has experienced anti-Semitism under this sort of guise of being about the conflict here, which is very tricky. And the Commission is trying to stay away from that, as it should.
Although it's interesting that they adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism.
The Commission adopted the
the government also has.
Yeah, which talks about anti-Zionism in particular. And that's been, I think, one of the key issues of the current form of anti-Semitism that we see across the world is the whole issue around anti-Zionism and what is appropriate to question the government of a day in Israel, and how do you separate the government of a day with issues around the legitimacy of the state of Israel itself?
You talked about free speech issues. People are concerned. Are they concerned that criticism of Israel is going to be conflated with anti-Semitism as a result of the focus on anti-Semitism post-Bondi attack?
Yes, absolutely. And I think when you listen to the testimonies of a lot of the people in the Commission itself, a lot of them are very, very connected to feelings of not being safe or being targeted because of a view on Israel or because they identify as Zionists, kids being kicked out of share houses because they're proudly Zionist.
My daughter went to a share house.
A share house, for those who are unfamiliar, is?
Sharing a flat together. So there was a pro-Palestinian thing in the window, like a flag or something like that, and it made it a place that she couldn't live in.
So there's very much this feeling, especially among young people, because a lot of university-aged people and young people in their 20s and 30s really are very pro-Palestinian in Australia for the most part. And I think there is a feeling, the way that we're raised and sheltered inside also the Jewish community in Australia in very isolated Jewish schools that for the most part are very Zionist, very pro-Israel.
Just historically, because unlike the American Jewish community, which has, multi-generational roots, the vast majority of Australian Jewry are directly Holocaust survivors and are very connected to the Holocaust. So their connection to the state of Israel is much more across the board, committed and tight than it is in many other countries.
We were kind of always regarded as the most Zionist community in the world.
It very deeply is. It's the biggest Holocaust survivor community outside of Israel, if I'm not mistaken. And it's also quite, in my view, it functions quite like a shtetl in that it is a very internal community and our institutions are internal. I grew up most of my life not meeting a non-Jewish person, honestly, until I came to Israel, which is a crazy thing to say, but it's true. And that's the experience, I think, of a lot of young people who are very much inside the community. And I think what we're especially seeing now, and I work with a lot of young people and I see them adopting more and more pro-Israel perspectives, actually, which I think you wouldn't expect, but really an inability to see or grapple with a reality on the ground here and an inability to articulate critical perspectives of the government or talk about Palestinian peoplehood in a positive way and that not feel like a threat or an affront to you. That's not something that I think young Jews in Australia in Jewish schools and institutions learn how to do and go out into the world and are suddenly confronted by all of these different views and perspectives by people who are consuming news and social media.
Has that changed after Bondi, Daniel, do you think? Is it still so insular? Or is it maybe even
our
more
community,
insular?
Is our community insular? I think we're probably correct to say that we're an insular community, but also to say that we have made a major contribution to Australian society over its history. There were Jews on the first fleet to Australia. The reality is that I think what is challenging for us in the public arena is that Jews being forced out of spaces, and that's really challenging for us. So I can give you a personal example where my son, who is a gay man, Pride and Prejudice, which is a anti-Zionist LGBTQI, I should say, organisation, made very threatening statements to the Dayenu, which is the Jewish LGBTQI organisation. The bottom line was that Dayenu pulled out. First 25 years, Dayenu had been participating in the Mardi Gras, which is a big event. 1 million people line the streets of Sydney. It's a really major cultural event for us. They were marginalised, and it was amazing listening to gay people talk about how they had felt marginalised from the Jewish community, and they were working for acceptance there. And all of a sudden, that the community in which they were a part of were also restricted. So we actually, what happened was that the Dayenu did in the end march. The Mardi Gras committee asked them to, and Sandra and I, my wife and I, actually marched with them, and quite a few members of our community and politicians decided to march with them and show support because, again, in an area of life, of culture in which we were being pushed out.
A quick update on the criminal case. The shooters was a father and son team. The father was killed. Naveed Akram he was wounded. He was in hospital, and since his recovery, he's been facing his criminal offenses. He initially faced 59 charges, and then recently, about a month ago, they added 19 charges to the case. Is the community satisfied with the pursuit of the criminal case against him? What's been the reaction? Is this something that people are not focusing on because they don't want to give him too much attention?
I think that the community is happy that the authorities are dealing with the case, and these cases tend to take quite a long time in gestation, and the additional charges is not something that's unusual.
The identity of the shooters and their story is much more a conversation for the intelligence and security agencies of Australia, and in my view, the community thinks the same in a lot of ways. And I think this was an extreme act of terror, and it's viewed as something extreme. And I think what the community is much more concerned with is a normalization in ordinary life, day to day, of anti-Semitic acts that maybe are not so violent, even though, of course, there's been firebombings, etc., for the last few years, in fact. But it seems, even listening to the testimonies in the commission and the general discourse in the community, that it's very much about this normalization and less about what is very clearly quite a freak, extreme act that we could never have imagined happen here, even though I know they're probing ties to the Islamic State. And the police said early days that it was inspired by that, and this father and son and their connection to extreme imams in the Sydney community. In fact, the son, the 24-year-old shooter, he had been probed by ASIO, the security agency, in 2019 already. They found him to not be a direct threat. There's a lot of questions as to how they lost track of him and the allocation of resources in that way. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like that's less of the focus of the community now. And it's very much, are my kids safe to go to sport and not have Nazi slogans shouted at them on the soccer pitch? Because that is happening. And that's much more what people are also worried about.
Is that also your perception?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's very much those two men were exceptions to the rule, and we hope that the security that is being put in place around the community will ensure that we will remain safe. And to be honest with you, I don't know, you mentioned the name of, I can't remember the name of the guy. I remember the name of Ahmed Ahmed, who's the Muslim man that stood up and bravely stood up to the shooters at that time, but I don't remember the shooter's name.
Noa, you were in Australia when President Herzog visited a couple of months after the attack, and Daniel, I know that you took part in the events involving the president. It was a really big deal. I mean, there were protesters, and do you feel like it assured or made the Jewish community feel good that the president of Israel visited? Do you feel like it fanned the flames? What was that experience like?
I think it was an incredible visit, and I think it was really constructive. Initially, I was worried. So we'd come out of December 14, and we had quite a bit of goodwill there, and I was worried about the president coming and creating this divisiveness, and at a time when we were all trying to heal. To a certain extent, that was borne out. There were demonstrations, and they were quite ugly. And I happened to have got caught up in one because the president's visit in Sydney was in the city, and so we chose to take public transport in rather than drive. And we came. The demonstration, which was meant to be somewhere else, was right in the middle of the city, and we got caught up in it. It was angry and it was aggressive, and we felt really uncomfortable there. And there have been some implications as a result of that demonstration. But overall, I think it was amazing. You know why it was amazing? Because we all talking about the delegitimization of Israel, and it was a moment of legitimization. It was a moment in which our government recognized the Israeli government. He had full military honors when he was received in Canberra. It was really a moment of pride and a moment of acceptance. And it was almost like Albanese, who hasn't been the best around issues around Israel and has been a bit slow around issues of protection of the Jewish community. But at that moment, it was very statesmanlike to stand with the President Herzog and to express this support for the state of Israel and the right of the president to come and be with the Jewish people, to stand with the Jewish people in Australia. So whatever doubt I'd had prior to it and the sense of fear, and maybe that's my diaspora sense of fear, like, oh, let's not cause too much trouble, let's be good, but that turned into a moment of real pride. It was great when he was speaking Jewish, but the fact that he stood by our Prime Minister, that he was received with full military honours, that said something about about the relationship it renewed the relationship and reminded people of the relationship between Australia and New Zealand and Israel, two democracies standing side by side.
Noah, as a visiting Israeli, what was your perspective on it?
Yeah, I happened to be in the country at the time, and I went to cover his visit and the protests actually outside. I was in Melbourne at two massive demonstrations, the first I've been at actually since the war started. The question I think that arose at the time was why the president of Israel was coming to make the Jews of Australia feel better, as we were trying to create this disconnect between Israel and the war here and the Israeli government and the Jews of Australia and their safety. And suddenly an official invite had gone to the president of the state of Israel, not the Zionist Federation, not an Israeli organization, the representative of the Israeli government, which I think the timing of that made it quite complicated to speak about. Is this a person who represents the Jews of Australia at the same time as the Jews of Australia were trying to say this government does not necessarily represent us and we shouldn't be targeted because of our affiliation or not? I think also because the Royal Commission has the anti-Semitism and social cohesion. There was a big question of how is this helping the social cohesion of Australia when the president of a country who has been, at the helm of some crimes that the government has committed in Gaza at the end of 2.5 years of a very brutal war in Gaza and in Lebanon, and at that point also the first big Iran war, there was a big question mark for a lot of the general Australian public over why is this the figure that is being brought to heal the Jews. I know that internally a lot of, especially young Jewish people, felt the same way. They felt, why is this person being brought to represent me? This person doesn't represent me. And in those protests outside both the big official event and also in the Melbourne CBD where I was, there was a lot of anger and disappointment at the government for, I think people felt like they had capitulated to this desire to bring an Israeli representative. And there was a lot of anger about that. And I think it felt to me they're very connected to what the Israeli military has been doing in its conduct in its wars, and why that was an appropriate figurehead to bring in the time, especially of the commission. And it created a lot of very complicated feelings for a lot of people.
So speaking of complicated feelings, even more than the United States, I come from my perspective as an American Jew. I've spent time in Australia. Similarly, Australia was just viewed as this, in Yiddish, goldene Medina, a really golden state, an amazing ultimate refuge for Jews, and even more so because of the close connection between the Holocaust and Australian Jewry. Really a place where Jews can feel safe and secure. So I'm interested in whether that has fundamentally changed, both over the past 3 years of war and strife post October 7th, but most importantly, in the past 6+ months since the attack on Bondi.
It's changed. We don't feel safe as we did before. We don't feel. I talked a little bit about spaces not being available to us today, like they were previously. Our sense of self-worth, our belief in our contribution to Australia has been questioned today, and we are struggling with that. It's most obvious in the fact that our walls are being built higher and higher. So there's this feeling that the Jewish community by almost default is being isolated from the rest of Australian society. So I just read today that we're receiving even more funds for security. So one of the easiest things to do post Bondi was to throw money at security, and they've done that. And today when I go to synagogue, there are police outside. So what's changed, for example, is that in the past we looked after our own security, but the need has become now that we can no longer do that alone. We need the state to look after our security. So we're feeling a little bit isolated, a little bit lonely, and we fear for the future. I fear for my kids. I'm retired. If you don't include my involvement in the community and the many boards I'm on, I'm retired. But I think a lot about my kids. I think a lot about the fact that my son doesn't, when he's in Israel, because he doesn't want his contemporaries to know that he's in Israel, because he would find that hard to justify to them. That's a bit scary, and I wonder what the future is.
This has been a really fascinating and enlightening discussion for somebody who closely follows what's going on in Israel and the United States and not so much in Australia. I appreciate it. I'm sure the listeners appreciate it. Daniel Hochberg and Noa Levin, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.
And that wraps things up for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guests, Daniel Hochberg and Noa Levin. And thank you to my producer and editor, Adi Shacham. If you like the podcast, you want to keep listening and make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And feel free to leave us a comment or a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, Shalom from Tel Aviv.